Good afternoon all. Welcome to Government House and to Winter Conversations. My name is Georgia Minucci and I'm a Protocol Officer here at Government House. Today, in contributing to the public discourse on issues that help create a strong and healthy community, we will be exploring the opportunities and challenges of genomics and precision medicine. As we start, could I please ask that you ensure your mobile phones are on silent? The session is being live streamed on Facebook and will later be available on the Governor's website. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the conversation. Today, Her Excellency will be in conversation with Professor Alex Brown, Professor Indigenous Genomics with the Telethon Kids Institute and the Australian National University, and Professor Deborah White, Theme Leader, Precision Cancer Medicine, South Australian Health and Medical Research Institute. Professor Alex Brown is an internationally leading Aboriginal clinician and researcher from the Yuin Nation on the south coast of New South Wales. His career has focused on Aboriginal health in the provision of public health services, infectious diseases and chronic disease care, healthcare policy and research. Alex was the Aboriginal Health Equity Theme Leader, SAMRI, for 10 years and is a former Professor of Medicine at the University of Adelaide. Recently, his research has focused on novel clinical trials in cardiometabolic disease with Indigenous communities. In addition to her role of Director, Precision Cancer Medicine at SAMRI, Professor Deb White is the group leader of its Acute Lymphoblastic Leukemia Genomics and Functional Genomics Research Group. She is also a professor in both the Faculty of Health and Medical Sciences and the Faculty of the Sciences at the University of Adelaide. Deb's specific interest is in maximising the impact of personalised medicine, both in adults and children, through rationally targeted therapies for acute lymphoblastic leukemia. She leads a group of scientists and bioinformaticians in the interpretation of genomic data and the curation of clinical relevant genomic alterations in leukemia patients. Please welcome Her Excellency and our esteemed guests.
Gana bogana alia gana miana alia, yaitia miana alia kumatana yartananko. Nyatuna tampandi gana miana, yaitia matina bokinanko yalaka takaricha. I acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people today, from the past, today and into the future. And I want to particularly acknowledge and welcome any Aboriginal people who may be with us today, and I know there are some, whether from Kaurna country or other lands and regions. And of course, Alex, it's wonderful to have you here from the Yuin Nation. Now, we're on the cusp of NAIDOC week. I have to say this is serendipitous, but we are on the cusp of NAIDOC week. And this morning, again fortuitously, Alex and I were at a special event at SAMRI to launch the first ever Medical Journal of Australia collaboration with the Investiture Institute, an edition which is entitled Centering Indigenous Knowledges, but all of the research papers contributed have been contributed by Indigenous researchers, all obviously on health. The final item, Alex tells me he's actually contributed to 3 of the papers, but the last one in the edition is towards precision cancer medicine for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cancer health equity. So in a way that brings our 2 speakers together in a way that I hadn't necessarily anticipated. These winter conversation series, and I must say, looking out the window, it looks more like a lunch on the lawns day rather than a winter conversation series, but that's great. We always like to bring to you and to seek your engagement on issues which are relevant. Sometimes they're things that no one needs to do any homework about because we all know about them. And sometimes they take us into areas of knowledge that might not be something that we know a great deal about. So today, for me anyway, and perhaps for some of you, that is the case. So what we'd like to do first up is just lay the groundwork a little bit, and then we'll talk everyone into this, and we'll get to know Alex and Deb a little bit better. And then, as always, I promise that we will allow plenty of time for your questions. So where we're going to start really is the CSIRO tells us that Australians rank amongst the healthiest people in the world, with our health system one of the most efficient and equitable. And that should make us feel good. But we then hear, and we know actually, that there are some significant challenges to address. For example, Australians spend on average 11 years of our lives in ill health, the highest amongst OECD countries. There's also a 10-year life expectancy gap between the health of non-Indigenous Australians and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And in South Australia, I happen to know as patron of the Royal Flying Doctor Service that gap is even larger. So there are complex challenges, clearly, which require a range of approaches. One exciting field, genomics and precision medicine, holds great promise in the prevention and treatment of illness in our community. Already, gene therapy and targeted drug therapies are being employed in the treatment of conditions such as spinal muscular atrophy type 1, inborn errors of metabolism, cystic fibrosis, again I'm patron of Cystic Fibrosis SA, and inherited retinal eye diseases. Genomics and precision medicine presents us with great possibility. Deb, I'm going to ask you first. Could you begin by explaining to us, because we want to step up our knowledge here, in simple terms, what is genomics and what is precision medicine, and what drew you to a career in this field? And we want to take it right back, because we have got some younger members of the audience, to what was in your mind when you were having to make decisions about your future?
So we'll start with the first question, and I'll hopefully remember the third. So the first question is, what is genomics? Genomics is actually a really new field, and it's actually a term we don't use very well, and it's poorly understood. It's evolving field, really. So pre-2000, we couldn't have done genomics, because genomics is actually the deep dive into what your DNA looks like. So we used to do genetics, and some of you would have heard of genetics. Genetics is looking at genes. Genomics looks deeper than that, so it looks at the entire genome. So we unravel the chromosomes, we unravel the genes, and we look at what is in the DNA, the A's, the C's, the T's and the G's, that actually make up our genetic code. So the body's really, really clever at assembling 4 letters into what are essentially genes that then wrap themselves up in chromosomes and allow us to function. We undo all of that, and we sequence the A's, the G's, and the C's and the T's, and we work out whether they're normal. You don't say that too often. And we work out whether they're normal or abnormal, at least in my instance, working in cancer. So precision medicine is also one of those terms that is evolving, I think. We used to call it, and probably Alex and I started working in the area where it was personalised medicine. And that was the right drug for the right patient. So if you had a particular disease and there were a few predisposing factors within your body or your disease presented in a certain way, you were treated on who you were and what your disease looked like. Probably one of the best first examples of personalised medicine was probably blood grouping and blood transfusion, come to think of it. Now it's very much precision, because we can be much more precise in our diagnosis. So we've moved from that personalised to a precision space. And largely, obviously this is a genomics discussion, but largely that's based on what your genomics, or what the genomics of your disease is, and what your background genomics are. So in theory, we can tailor therapy to overcome your disease. And the other side of precision medicine is reduce the toxicity. So if we use chemotherapy, for example, we hit almost every dividing cell in your body, so there are side effects. Hair falls out. Many of you would be very familiar with that. In theory, in precision medicine, we're going to actually target the cancer, not the normal cells. So the outcome should be much better. Third one was...
What drew you to it?
Well, we were discussing this at lunch. I remember when I was in high school, and I'm not going to, let's face it, it'd take me a long time to get from there, so I'm not going to go year to year. But when I was in high school, we were told things like, the sort of job that you do isn't even available now. not known about. I thought that was rubbish. Pretty sure most people think most things teachers tell them in late high school is, not right, but in fact it's true. So there was no way in the world I could have said when I was at the end of high school at 18 that I was going to be doing genomics in leukemia. That didn't exist, couldn't possibly be done. My training was in diagnostic haematology. So I was a trained diagnostician for many years, moved into a research field looking at leukemia, actually looking at diseases such as thalassemia and haemophilia, so genetic diseases actually. And then into haematology, did a PhD in chronic myeloid leukemia, and then moved into acute lymphoblastic leukemia because by the time I finished my PhD I wanted to start my own group, and now have been supporting that group for about 14 years, looking at the genomics of ALL, of acute lymphoblastic leukemia.
Excellent, thank you. Well, that I could follow all of that. I hope everyone could you follow all of that too? Right, I think this is going to work. Thank you, Deb. Let me turn now to Alex. What drew you to researching genomics? Three-part question for you as well. In particular, the genomics of Australians, Indigenous people. And this is really interesting, this part of it, I think. What makes Indigenous people unique, genomically speaking?
Well, thanks. It's a great pleasure to be here and lovely to spend some time with Deb again. It's been a little while. My background is, obviously I grew up on the south coast of New South Wales, and I was going to be a naval architect. Mm-hmm. So it's quite a change from there. I had a cadetship to work at Garden Island in Sydney, do mechanical engineering. But I used to spend my holidays going up to Newcastle where my older sister was in medical school. So I used to go and hang out in the lectures. Like a fool, I thought, well, this doesn't sound so bad. And then she pretty much pressed me to say, well, you could do engineering or you could focus on people. So that was the first shift. I then went through med school, started as a clinician in intensive care medicine, and then got an opportunity to travel overseas and do a Masters of Public Health. And that was really focused on populations rather than just every single individual patient. And I sort of realised that I had to do that job. I started running the Centre for Disease Control in Alice Springs after coming back from overseas, and focused on outbreaks, immunisation policy. Had COVID hit back in those years, we would have run the COVID response in Central Australia. But then gradually got drawn into a research career. The first work was focused on understanding why health inequality exists. This 10-year life expectancy differential was the real focus of our work, and what that took us to was the primary cause of those life expectancy differentials for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were chronic conditions like heart disease, like diabetes, and unfortunately now, including cancer. So we started with trying to understand why those differences existed, and then working with healthcare systems to overcome those, to find novel ways of reducing those inequalities. And in the meantime, this genomic story was emerging. And in fact, from Aboriginal people's interests, there was a great deal of concern and scepticism. And we approached it really from an ethics perspective, because there was very strong Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander bioethics expertise in the country, and that's looking at the ethics of research and how to do things the right way. And they were very nervous, so they decided to focus on how do we manage, oversee, control, and protect Indigenous people's rights in genomics research. And then I spent 10 years waiting for somebody to turn up and focus their attention on Indigenous genomics, and I was going to help them. Deb knows this because this was during the early years of my time at SAMRI. I was like, oh, this genomic stuff is really important, but somebody else is going to have to do it. And then no one turned up, and I was left to say, well, sometimes the time comes where you have to step up. So we decided to enter this space. Our initial thoughts were, there must be something particularly special about us as Indigenous Australians. We've been here for 65,000 years. That doesn't happen by chance. You have to be really, really clever and strong and capable and able to adapt and survive and endure for that period of time in a place like Australia. Our interest was to understand whether or not this genomics story could help us to unpack why we see such high rates of disease, and more importantly, what the hell were we going to do about it? And that led to the development of our genomics, Indigenous genomics team, now based here in Adelaide. But we have tentacles that reach right across the country. And our job is to, firstly, empower communities so that they can make their decisions about being involved in genomics or not. And then being very clear about our plans to demonstrate how genomics could be used for benefit and how it can influence the health and well-being of our communities. And that uniqueness that we assumed about us being a little bit special, because we've been here forever, is certainly starting to bear out in the evidence we see in the genetic story that Deb touched on. What's special and unique about Indigenous Australians? We are different. We're different from European populations, but we're also different between communities, which when we see this data, we say, well, of course we're all different, because we know how, from a cultural perspective, communities are very unique. This story is now visible in people's genetic story too. And we think there's a lot of strength and wonder, as well as we hope opportunity for better health outcomes by understanding this story.
Great.
That's how we do it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Now, Deb, you gave a couple of examples earlier on, but I'd just like to draw you out a little bit more on how genomics and precision medicine are already playing a role in our healthcare. I mean, some people have insights into that, but how should we think about that? And in terms of the relevance in our own health journeys, what might that look like going forward?
I think most people would be, and probably personalised medicine is a better term to use for what most of us would have experienced. As I said, blood transfusions, for example. Vaccine technology is not necessarily about us, but it's definitely about the bacteria. COVID vaccines are a good example. Everyone would have heard that story. That's precision medicine. It's precision medicine. It's talking about how to treat a particular bug, in that case, or virus, to prevent you from getting it. It doesn't destroy the virus, but I won't go through vaccine technology. There are a variety of different ways, diabetes testing and treatment, again, becoming very personalised, based on the sorts of things, as I mentioned earlier, the characteristics of both the disease and the patient taken into account. I think as we move further and further into personalised or precision medicine, we have to, and Alex and I have talked about this, we need to bring not only Indigenous people with us, but we need to bring the community as a whole. Because we are moving into a space where this is reality. We can do it now. We never used to be able to do it. We can sequence people's genomes. We can find out a lot about individuals for good, for the greater good of treatment, for the greater good of understanding disease, and for designing therapies. So we might find that someone has a disease that we don't understand or that we can't treat, but because we understand it and we have information about it, we can then treat it. And that's critical for moving the field forward. But our other, I think, real purpose has to be to actually bring our populations with us. Because you people have to understand, our general populations have to really understand what we're doing and how it may impact them. And it's complex. I minimised what genomics is, and I, to some extent, minimise what it can do. But we know a lot about you from genomics, and that's great, because if, for example, we decide to, let's say hypothetically, and it's probably not so hypothetical, we decide to sequence everyone when they're born. There's questions that go around that. Do you want to know your results? Do you want someone to explain those results to you? It's going to be handy one day if you end up in ICU And if we have your genome sequence, we know what drugs you're going to have a serious adverse event to, and you won't get them. So there are real positives in that sort of data. That's, you know, one tip of the iceberg. But there are real positives in that data being there. But what about when you go to take out life insurance? This is the conversations we absolutely have to be having. What are the impact, and how do we, and I do a little bit of this in my collaborations with America. I work on the Genomic Alliance, at the Global Alliance for Genomics, and we talk a lot about how we can explain this, how we bring it along, how do governments deal with it. At the moment, to most governments, it's a lot of money being spent on something, to be honest. But we really need to bring the conversation to how's this going to affect us? Is it a good thing and a bad thing? And Alex has an added complexity, but there also has to be an element for all of us of trust. And storage. Can I also mention storage of the data? There's only so many clouds out there.
Sure, and that might be an area that you'll be interested in following up when we get to questions. Alex, you just, in your first answer, you talked about the chronic disease load, and you gave examples of that: heart disease, cancer, diabetes for Indigenous Australians. What are the key factors driving that? I mean, people might think they've got some idea, but from a research perspective, what's driving it, and how might genomics research help close that gap?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Look, we understand in all populations the primary drivers of things like heart disease are the things that we would all know of. Too much smoking, poor diets, not enough exercise, poor access to food, high cholesterol or bad fats in your blood. Having diabetes is a very strong driver of people developing heart disease. But there's also other stories at play here. There's stories about how the environment in which you live can influence not just those standard risk factors, but also your chances of being exposed to those more toxic environments. We know that disadvantage plays. Those who are more likely to be impoverished or experiencing disadvantage have poorer diets, poorer access to healthy foods, less ability to afford their fancy gym membership, which they may never attend to. So you pay for a whole year and, oh, I went there twice, I wonder if that was worth it. They're more likely to be exposed to chronic stresses, to pollutions. These are all things that can contribute to the development of chronic disease. But if we try to make sense of that in the inequalities we see in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, we know that those standard understandings of what drives disease don't really tell the full story. And we still see inequalities on top of what we would account for by usual understandings of what drives disease. And this led us into the genomics space. Is there a story to be told or a way to understand better what drives disease and what drives the inequitable burden of disease that we see in our communities? And then what are we going to do about it? So our genomics entry was really about trying to further understand where we began, which is what drives inequality and what are we going to do about it? And genomics for us, even though it is a very important scientific agenda, for us it's a set of tools. How can we use the best that science offers us to provide better outcomes to communities who have the highest level of need? And that is fundamentally the story of dealing with inequity.
Thank you. You're looking as if you might want to say something, Deb.
Very unusual for me.
Fancy that, Deb.
One of the things, and I think we've talked about it before, but it's probably something that's worth sort of raising and then maybe following up later, is so we have Indigenous communities that live in town cities. We have Indigenous communities that live on lands. I've always been intrigued as to whether we separate the two when we do things like genomics, etc. And I know it's early days. But is there a difference? So how much does the environment play into that, or does it not? And you're probably not down that far enough down the road yet to know that.
We spent a lot of time thinking about this, Deb. We do look at this. We haven't looked at the specific genetic architecture or story for each person that may differ between, say, town and bush. But we have looked at the impact or burden of disease across these different locations, and it depends on what disease you're interested in. Historically, if we looked at, say, heart disease, the burden of heart disease in all of our work for the last 20 years was higher in town.
Yep.
However, diabetes is completely opposite, much higher in remote communities. So the reasons that there is different burdens of disease depends on the disease and depends on the environment in which people live. The genes will be a part of that story, but won't be the whole story. So the question is,
predisposition, but you, okay.
We would think so. Now, there was a lot of conversations about whether or not Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's ability to survive tens of thousands of years ago set them up for a particular way of the body operating, which we may be able to read in the gene and the gene story, has now become a liability.
Yep.
But the evidence isn't clear on that yet. It makes some inherent sense, but the work is yet to be done. The more important question for me, sorry for the microphone.
I've done that too, actually. We have to.
I'm glad to lead the way. The more important question is, what are we going to do about it?
Yep.
And the question is, how can we utilise the tool of genomics to better target not just the treatments that are on offer, and genomics is prime time in things like rare disease, in diagnosis, and in precision cancer, which Deb and Tim have led very strongly from South Australia, but also how we can utilise this to build a more personalised approach to preventing disease into the future. And that's where we're heading.
Okay, thank you both for that. Deb, it might be that your particular field has attracted some members of our audience today, and I wondered if you might just tell us a bit more about your research with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and how has your research been translated into practical applications?
Sure. So acute lymphoblastic leukemia is the most common childhood leukemia or childhood cancer. So it's a disease we see right across the spectrum. Youngest patient we've ever sequenced was 37 weeks gestation. The oldest has been mid to late 80s.
Yeah.
So we see predominantly it's a childhood disease, but certainly we see it, as I said, all through the ages. We knew a little bit about the disease, so it's invariably fatal if not treated correctly or treated well. And we knew that some parts or some types, some patients did really, really badly, and others didn't do too bad. So it's a bit like the Alex sort of story with the Indigenous groups. And so there was some work that was done by a good collaborator of ours who worked in, or a good collaborator of mine who worked in, we trained together in Adelaide. He then went to St Jude's and did the first genomic sequencing of a very small number of acute lymphoblastic leukemia patients. And we got to talking at several meetings, and in the end he said, you should set this up in Australia. And I'm not sure I can do genomics because I didn't know how. But we put a grant in together, we got the funding, and the rest is history. What we discovered, and this is now a global project, what we discovered was that group of diseases that we knew there were differences in. So just using cytogenetics or looking at the chromosomes, we could tell there were differences between patients. We thought there were about 8 or 9 different groups of ALL. We now know there's approaching 30 different groups based on genomic sequencing. And we can target many of those with some of the drugs that already exist. And there are groups around the world that are working to develop drugs. I'm not a drug developer, but there are groups who are working to develop drugs to target many of those other cases. So how's it translated? We get a sample into the lab. We can define with about 80 to 85% now certainty what sort of subgroup the patient has. We do that increasingly rapidly, thanks to really clever people in my group, bioinformaticians, who can have a black box, I call it, and the sequence goes in and they come out at the other end, and it gives us some indication. And we have a team who sit down and curate that. That result goes through what we call a molecular tumour board, where many clinicians from around Australia and bioinformaticians and scientists will look at the data and make some decisions based on that as to what risk we think the patient is at. That goes back to the clinic, and the patient is treated. So rapidly translating, really important area where we now engage in all clinical trials in acute lymphoblastic leukemia around Australia, so that we can understand the impact of genomics and therefore the impact of the different treatments we're using on different genomic subtypes. So it's actually evolved very rapidly, but that's been a global effort, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's something that we read about and people know about. I'm sure all of us know people who've been beneficiaries of this research so far. What would be, what's the next big thing in this area, if I can ask you that? What should it be? What would you like it to be? Maybe that's a better way of putting it.
Oh, that could go on a while. I think what I'd like to see is that every patient who's diagnosed actually with any cancer, so let's take it just out of ALL, ends up on a clinical trial. Because I think if you end up on a clinical trial, and there are many of them going for all different sorts of diseases, you get the best possible chance, get the best possible therapy, or the most up-to-date therapy. You get the clinicians, and Alex can talk to this better than I, but you get the clinicians who are experts in the field who are running those clinical trials. And you get what we provide with ALL, which is that national engagement. So people dial in, people talk to you about, I spend probably every morning of the week, well, 5 mornings a week, I would have 3 phone calls before I leave home of a morning about what samples can come in and what we can do. And so I think we need to engage the community again, but we need to empower the community to say, I've just been diagnosed with breast cancer, I'll just accept whatever my oncologist says. You should be asking your oncologist what clinical trials are available, what are the latest studies, and can I have a conversation about that? Because that's where we should be going. All medicine should be precision. We should really be getting very much to the stage where we empower people and we use the best drugs. And we're not going to cure everybody. We can't all live forever. I know that sounds terrible, but you can't. But we can certainly, I think we need to be aiming to get really good results, but we need to stop the burden of disease that happens at the end of that treatment as well, which is another area of our work. Looking at how we minimise toxicity so that those children who had leukemia who survive don't end up with horrendous diseases down the track because of the way we treated them when they were 4.
Hear to that. Alex, practical applications from your research so far?
Well, so we're very early in. We've only just really commenced this in the last couple of years. We've been running a large cohort study, that is getting a whole bunch of people in communities and tracking them over time here in South Australia. Aboriginal communities right across the state who agreed to engage with us in this work. That's been going for almost 10 years now. I think the question before was, well, where is precision medicine playing now? I think the 2 strongest cases are in rare disease, which I mentioned, and precision cancer efforts. The cardiovascular disease, there are elements of precision medicine already at play. So there are hereditary-based conditions associated with how high your cholesterol might be, or whether or not your heart rhythm functions the way that most other people's do, so we call arrhythmias. There are therapies in cardiovascular medicine based on treatments that were identified from precision medicine. So that's in play. But the struggle is, how do we actually utilise the precision medicine story in a more detailed and embedded way within the healthcare system that we currently have? And part of that is trying to utilise genomics to predict who's going to have trouble in the future. We call this risk prediction. We are trying to use it, as Deb touched on, around who's getting the right diagnosis and then who's getting the right treatment according to that, which can be aided by genomics and genetic testing. The challenge we have is there's significant inequity even within this system. So you can have cancer, you can have genetic testing if you're lucky enough to have access to that. There may be a target for a treatment that's identified from that particular genetic sequence, but you may not be able to access a treatment. And you may be much less likely, say, if you live in regional or remote Australia, to have access to any of that. So we have profound inequity within the operationalisation. And I know that's not a word. If there's any grammar people here, please, my apologies. My auntie would be very upset at me saying that word. The challenges are, how do we actually take precision medicine to prime time? And how do we make sure we don't leave people behind? All who need should get. And that's the society we feel we're a part of. This is the society we need to be a part of. So inequity within the application of advanced technologies for health and well-being can't leave anyone behind. And in fact, it should be able to help reduce the gap between the haves and have-nots. And that's our agenda.
Thank you for that. You've mentioned South Australia specifically in a couple of instances, but I imagine people here, there may be some visitors from interstate as well, but how is South Australia from both of your perspectives? How are we faring in this field of genomics and precision medicine? What are we doing well? How can we improve?
Do you want to start there?
Expensive technology, and so it is very expensive to do this sort of, to perform these sort of applications. We, at the moment, so for all I mentioned all the things we do on patients in the clinical studies, we do all that from grants that we write. So there's no government funding for any of that at this point, Australia-wide. So there's many of us working on that, but the health systems have a lot to look at the moment. So we sort of fall down the pecking order a little bit. I think we're doing really well in genomics, actually. I think we've been very stable. I don't think we haven't, there's been a lot of hype and publicity about other genomics groups that have kind of started off on a commercial bent and then had to come back and then fallen over slowly. So I think, South Australia is really good at being pretty meticulous about what we do and steady as you go. And I think that's put us to a solid base. So that would probably be, there's still a hell of a lot of work to do though.
That's true. I think Deb's been quite reserved, to be honest. I think I'm much more bullish about where South Australia is on the genomics front. I think we're extremely well placed. I think Tim and Deb's work in the leukemia space and precision medicine probably been undersold significantly. It is a poster child for doing this work and increasing its scale. And that's been very much a South Australian story. I think we're now in Indigenous genomics probably leading the way in how we do this work, how we get it done, what it means in terms of the health and well-being of communities, much more than what's happening elsewhere at this stage. And we're leading national efforts to build an Indigenous genomics ecosystem. And that's happening from right here in South Australia. There's other elements. The Sagency team are clearly world-leading experts in their fields. We've got a very clear and well thought through connection of genomics within clinical care, which I think happens extremely well here. We're underdone on a whole bunch of fronts, but we should be feeling very proud that we're in good shape, but we hope that the future is bigger and better and stronger, and we can't do that without the community.
Well, thank you both. That sounds like the perfect point to go to questions, Georgia, because we're talking about the community and that's you, so yes, let's do that.
We will now take questions from the floor, so we will have roving microphones, so please raise your hand if you have a question. The Q&A will be facilitated by Her Excellency.
Right, so just to get a feel for who thinks they might like to ask a question, would you raise your hand if you think over the next 20 minutes, because we've got 20 minutes, got one hand going up so far. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, it'll lead to more. I just wanted to know whether I needed to add a few in, but I think I probably don't. Let's give the first questioner, and could you please, when you get the microphone, and if you wouldn't mind just standing, if you could state your name, even if you know that I know you, and your affiliation, and then ask, ideally, just a brief question. Don't worry too much about who you want to direct it to necessarily, because Deb and Alex are very good at doing that. We'll start with the one in the back row, and then from then on, I'll probably take them a couple at a time, because I think we've got enough questions to support that approach. So first up.
Thank you, that was very interesting. My name is Lise Windsor. I'm actually with the Adelaide Repertory Theatre Board, but I'm here just out of general interest. I guess outside of clinical trials, the cost of these types of treatments to the patients can be exorbitant and out of reach for many people. So I guess my question is, how many people are missing out on the potential benefits of this type of medicine just because it's a lot of it is user pays, even with some Medicare rebates. Just an example, in the area of IVF, for example, many people are missing out on this type of medical approach because of the cost involved to them.
Thank you, Lisa.
So this is a great question, and this sort of builds on that conversation about who gets and who's missing out. The challenge is, obviously, inequity is inbuilt within our society. This is one of the great challenges that we face moving forward. There are probably a lot of people missing out from the opportunities afforded through genomics, and part of that is a financial reality. But we've still got work to do to make clear how genomics is of direct and meaningful benefit to every patient. And that is still an emerging story. We touched on a couple of examples where genomics is what I would say is prime time. It's happening now in clinical medicine. But it's not huge. We've still got a medical system that does an extremely good job, and there's sometimes very simple things that we can do, that we should, and that most people are fortunate enough to get access to. So we've got to put genomics within its right context. It is not everything. It is not the panacea of health and well-being for the future, but it's a really important part of how we should be thinking and what we need to grow and develop. The bigger challenge for us is, I don't think it's going to be a financial challenge in the next 10 years. We've already seen the cost of sequencing one human genome go from $1 billion down to well under $1,000. The question is how a government's going to pay. And the challenge won't be paying for the test in a few years' time, because it'll be just like an X-ray. The challenge for the money story is, how do you deploy it? Do we have the right workforce to sit in a dark room and look at all of the data and make sense of it? And then how do we actually use it for each patient? So the bigger question is, what's the right workforce? How we train the right people moving forward? The test will become, my view is, the test will become the smaller part of the story. It's what do we do with it, and do we have the workforce in the health system that can manage it? That's the bigger challenge.
Deb?
I think the other thing that have made governments a little bit nervous about taking on some of these drugs as well, and we know that so many drugs go for approval, is that there was probably happened in the 90s, maybe early 2000s, massive enthusiasm for magic bullet type theories, and where you had a magic drug and it worked, so you tried it on every patient. They were the days where we didn't know much about the patients, and many of those drugs fell by the wayside. In fact, one of the drugs that Alex was talking about that Tim Hughes and I worked on, was a drug that fell by the wayside in a very similar way. We then realised what it actually did. That was actually part of my PhD, to work out how the thing worked. And it was then deployed for patients. So we, as scientists and as diagnosticians and people who work in the health system, we need to make sure that we're confident with what we're putting out. We need to make sure that we're confident we've got the right patient for the right drug. And I think that will also help in the scenario that you're talking about. And I'm not an expert in IVF, but certainly for some of the drugs that you're talking about, we will say with levels of certainty whether you will or won't benefit from this. So it doesn't become the person next door to me has the same disease as me and I'm not getting the drugs that they're getting, etc. It's actually about you. And once we have that degree of certainty, then we can certainly push some of these drugs through, through whatever it's called, reimbursement.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to take two questions because I think there are probably 8 or 9. Would you, everyone who wants to raise one? All right, we might have a woman here on this side and then in the third row back, the gentleman there. Thank you. So that's one there and then one literally on the other side of the aisle. But we'll ask them 2 together and then we'll seek answers from the panel.
I'm getting excellent instructions here on how to ask this question. So Alex, I really liked...
So your name?
Yasmin Harmon-Smith. I didn't introduce myself because Alex knows me, we work together. Yasmin Harmon-Smith, I'm from the Telethon Kids Institute.
Yep.
Alex, I liked the way you mentioned prevention as being part of the solution, especially for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And I guess we didn't hear a lot about that, but when I think about the challenges facing health service delivery in a lot of these communities, I'm not sure that we'll get there in terms of delivering the benefit of a cure when a disease has already happened. So I just wondered whether you could elaborate a little bit on how the prevention might help.
And let's just get the second question as well, if we can, just so that we can, this will help us involve the maximum number of people.
Well, thank you both for an inspiring talk. And also to acknowledge that Alex inspired Rotary to create 2 PhD scholarships to train Aboriginal students in the prevention of chronic disease in Aboriginal communities.
Your name, please, sir.
Frank O'Neill.
Frank, thank you, Frank.
We've got the scholarships, but we have difficulty finding qualified candidates. So we'll talk to you more. My question goes to, it's not so long ago when we aligned genetics with eugenics. And my question is now, does genomics have some sort of security process and an ethical framework so that evil people don't actually get to use it in the former way it was?
Yasmin and Frank, thank you both very much. Now, how would you 2 like to deal with those?
That's the first one.
The prevention.
Yes.
So we'll start with the prevention. Thanks for that, Yasmin. We'll get to your eugenics in a second. So the prevention story, the challenge is how we actually take this technology to deploy for prevention for the longer term, especially when we're at the start of the journey. The reality is it's going to take a lot of information. The whole thing about precision medicine and precision prevention is have enough information to be able to work out who's going to benefit from this particular prevention approach compared to somebody else. Our appetite is to learn through our work with Indigenous adults how we're going to apply this to the next generation. I'm assuming, Yasmin, seeing your work at the Telethon Kids Institute, what does this all mean? By the time they get to me with their heart disease and their diabetes, a lot of that is a little late. The question is, how can we take our lessons and apply it as early as possible to prevent disease in the first place? The real answer to that is a little mind-boggling. You would need to have data on the entire population, say of South Australia, that's not just about their genomic story, but is about their educational outcomes, their diet, their environment, where they grew up, where they lived, so that we can actually model back through handling that information what the right solution might be for a particular person. So that's a fair way away, but it is absolutely where we're heading. We know that the application of prevention in genomics can be at the primary prevention phase. So you know someone's exposed to something that's not good for them. Can genomics and what you learn from it help you mitigate that impact? We can certainly use it in secondary prevention, which is finding a disease early. So before it's clinically relevant or clinically you're aware of it, and it's diagnosed, you have subclinical disease. Heart disease is a classic. People will have that build-up of plaque in their coronary arteries for 20 or 30 years before they have an event. If you can pick it up as early as possible, can you then get the right treatment in early and stop the progression of that disease? And then we know when people are diagnosed with a condition, there may be the application of genomics, as Deb touched on, right treatment, reduce side effects, get better outcomes, improve quality of life. So we know that there's a story there. How we get it to the next generation to prevent their disease, there's still a lot of work to do. But that's where we're going.
I would follow on from that just very briefly and say we then need to also, and I probably said this a little bit earlier as well, we need to know that you want to know. Because not everyone does. So prevention, we can prevent probably, and it is probably because we don't actually know we can, but we can probably have a big impact on disease globally actually as a global resource. But we need the population to want that to happen. And not everyone wants to know. And that's actually something that we need to work through. How secure is your data? That's a tricky question. So I think I'll answer it very positively because I believe in what we do at the moment. And so our data is very secure. There is no data, and I'll put some caveats around that. There is no data that's linked to a patient's name ever stored. So your genomics data is, so your sample is decoded or coded. Most of the time that is in a way that through various different unlinked databases, we can reassociate you with that, but no one else can. So there is a variety of levels of encryption through that. But your genomic code or your data, as far as your genomics, will be linked to A67432. And nowhere will you find in any database that's actually linked to that's that patient. That's what we do now. It scares some people to know that we actually don't at SAMRI, I don't think. She says that very confidently and then backs down a little. Store on cloud, but many do, and we will have to. There isn't enough buildings in the city to store it any other way. But things like Google Cloud are incredibly safe now. So yes, that's a community expectation, and it's something that we need to talk about, and it's an ongoing conversation. Particularly, there are predators out there, and we know that. So our way of getting about it is to separate all pieces of the puzzle so that there are limited people. I can't reconstruct as head of the lab. I need other people to bring pieces of the puzzle to me.
We're thinking about those.
You have to think about it all the time.
More questions. One here and then one in the front row, and then the gentleman with his hand up near the back. Let's start with the front though, thanks.
Thank you very, very much. Very fascinating and really, really significant. I worked in refugee health and migrant services.
Your name? Your name? Everyone's forgetting to...
Angelica Tyrone.
Thank you, Angelica.
I worked in refugee health and migrant services and looked at all... part of it was always keeping data and also doing research, non-encrypted at that stage because of other reasons. And one of the things that we found were the migrants that came to Australia, South Australia, looking at South Australia, but also across Australia, actually life expectancy and looking at the statistics were higher than the average Australian population. And is there some learning that can be done in relation to that internationally? Because you're actually working on this with an international scope. And particularly Northern European, because at that point it was the Northern Europeans that are the ageing one in our population. I just found that rather fascinating, and it hasn't come up in any discussion because it could be used as a way of thinking about better outcomes.
Can we just take the second question, because the panel's always keen to ask a question so they don't have to remember too many more. Yeah. But thank you, Angelica. Up the back there.
Hi, Alex, Craig Ritchie. I'm here in Adelaide as part of the Lowicha Board meeting. I was going to ask a question about the interface between your work and primary health care, but I think you've kind of covered that. What I am interested in, though, on the back of this gentleman's question about eugenics is the application of principles of Indigenous data sovereignty and where relevant, return to country and repatriation, because I know ANU has done some significant work in returning historic samples to country. So I wonder if you could just talk about that.
Thank you, Craig.
Maybe I'll take the first one because the second one's more... I'm not sure I know. So we know that Northern Europeans actually do really well wherever they are. I think I've always put that down to diet. Yeah. But whether there is... So your question and part of your commentary is correct. We could look at it, but we haven't. So there would be data globally. We do a lot of work with the Europeans as well. So there's data globally. Remembering that in my field I look at cancer. So we actually see the whole genome, but we're primarily looking at cancer-related genes. The data that we have, and it's one of the, and this may trip us up here, but it's one of the good and important things of what we do is that our data, de-identified from any patient, is available for people to look at, other research groups to look at, under a whole heap of legal frameworks, so that it is absolutely how we work globally, and it's also absolutely how we could address that sort of question. But I have to say I don't know of anyone who has. But I think it's a really interesting point. It's a little bit akin to the Aboriginal in the city versus the Aboriginal in the on land question as well, which I think we talk about. Next one's yours.
Alex, data sovereignty.
Yeah, so when I mentioned before the sort of immediate antibody response that Indigenous interests had to the Human Genome Project was an ethics response. It was actually the birth of the Indigenous data sovereignty movement, because that was the thing that we felt strongly that we had some sense of control over, which is what happens to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and other Indigenous people's information. How can that be used ethically? How can it be protected? How do we ensure the rights of Indigenous people frames what that data is used for? So it is impossible to develop the genomics, Indigenous genomics agenda without walking hand in hand with the Indigenous data sovereignty agenda. They are born of the same place, born of the same concerns, and linked together in terms of how can we do this moving forward. There is a very strong international movement for Indigenous data sovereignty of Indigenous scholars, Indigenous communities, and increasingly community control over what happens to the information that's collected, what information's collected, who makes decisions about how it gets used, can it be used against us for reasons nefarious or otherwise, how do we protect that? The challenge for us is building enough expertise in data sciences for Indigenous peoples and communities to manage that end-to-end for themselves. We're not quite there yet, but we need to be. And this will form a really important part of how genomics can be applied in healthcare settings. The first and most important to me is in the Aboriginal community-controlled health organisation framework. This is communities in control of healthcare for us. Now, we anticipate that's a 5 to 7 year agenda to get to a point where we can deploy genomics in routine daily practice of primary care provision for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, both in terms of collecting the right data for the right purposes, having the right tools where we can take the genomic sequence, this code that's unpacked, and work out the right drugs for that particular person, work out what someone's risk of future health or trouble might be, and the right workforce to manage whatever we find and deploy that at scale. And that's pretty much where we anticipate building our prevention agenda within, having a clear sense of someone's genomic story and what does that mean to their health now and into the future, and how do we do something about it. That's where we're heading.
Great. Well, look, thank you both very much from me. I was just sitting here thinking, I'd quite like to be one of your PhD students if I was into, if I could rewind a whole long way and retrain and do all of those things. But thank you for explaining it all so clearly and for your concision. It's meant that we've had a reasonable number of questions, but we somehow suddenly seem to leap from 1:10 to 1:30. So I'm going to hand back to Georgia, who'll get the proper thanks going. But thank you from me.
Friends, that concludes today's winter conversation with Professor Alex Brown and Professor Deborah White. Please thank Alex and Deb for generously sharing their experiences and thoughts with us today. The final winter conversation for 2024 will be held here at Government House on Friday the 2nd of August, with Her Excellency in conversation with Tim Jarvis, 2023 South Australian Australian of the Year, and Tiani Adamson, 2023 South Australian Young Australian of the Year. The discussion will centre on environmental leadership, in particular environmental advocacy and South Australia's efforts in addressing climate change. On a different note, on your way in today, you may have noticed some black boxes on the front lawn. Government House is pleased to feature in the Illuminate Adelaide Festival as part of the Popular City Lights program, a free event with installations along North Terrace and other CBD locations. Every evening there will be projection of light artist Philip Roker's work Time on the front facade of the house with music by Zarko Koma. The work will play on loop between 5:30 to 10:30 until the 21st of July, and we look forward to seeing you there. Again, thank you for coming today, and please enjoy the rest of your afternoon.